Since the days of the Old English, there have been exaggerated ideas about the color, character, and the culture of those with the rich skin complexion. And during the Civil War, many of these ideas were still very much pervasive, not only in the South, but also in the North, with none better to express them than the Union soldiers themselves, who made it a point to write some of these ideas in their letters when they wrote home. Now let's take a look at this subject by delving into Dr. Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, where it beginneth as follows. Although curious about what he would find in the South, the average Union soldier brought with him certain notions about black people, based largely on the racial beliefs and exaggerated caricatures with which he had been inculcated since childhood. The Union soldiers came from the North down to the South, where the vast majority of the people known as blacks were. And when they arrived, they already had in their mental world ideas about these people, which had been planted in their minds since they were children. And where did these ideas largely come from? Racial beliefs, that's one place. And what is race? It's an idea created by Europeans starting from the 15th century, which sought to classify human beings based on somewhat similar physical features. Nobody else took part in these classifications. It was only Europeans who began labeling people like ingredients on the back of food. And ultimately, they labeled those of the rich brown skin complexion with African ancestry as black, and they labeled themselves of the lighter European ancestry as white. Black representing evil, dark, and degraded people, and the opposite white representing pure, good, and civilized people, right? These classifications took place during the colonial expansion, and this is when the Europeans went around the world dominating everyone else and creating negative narratives about the people they encountered and dominated. And they linked these narratives with the racial categories, right? And this is one of the ways that the Union soldiers were indoctrinated with beliefs about blacks since they were a child. The other way was through exaggerated caricatures that were passed around through art, shows, and literature, which were made to reinforce the racial narratives, right? Let's continue going. His first impressions of the slaves he encountered invariably confirmed and reinforced those caricatures, and the descriptions he provided the folks at home dwelled upon them. If anything, their physical peculiarities struck him as even more pronounced than he had imagined. They were
so black that charcoal would make a white mark on them.
That's the first exaggeration. This is the same thing the early English travelers used to do when visiting parts of Africa. Do we remember this? This is in Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan's book, White Over Black, American Attitudes Towards the Negro, 1550 to 1812. And it's also in a variety of travelers' tales as well. They would report that the people were all very black, which is a very black lie. And because black is such a shocking concept in Western thought, many people find it humorous to describe people as that, right? And they make comments about seeing people so black that a charcoal would make a white mark on them.
Their mouths were excessively large, their lips excessively thick, and their noses excessively broad and flat.
Everything is just outrageously large and wide if you leave it up to him to tell it. And of course, this makes others intrigued because it sounds like he describes some type of wild animal or something like that, right? That's why the Europeans and the whites got such a kick out of creating the caricatures and making shows out of this with the blackface and all these other things with exaggerated physical features.
They are the genuine Negro here.
A Pennsylvania soldier wrote from South Carolina,
as black as tar, and their heels stick out a feet behind.
Who else thinks like this? Many people who call themselves black. They've taken on this humor as well, and a lot of them think that this is funny. But they don't understand the psychological damage behind this, or else they wouldn't think that it was funny and they wouldn't call themselves that name, right? The comedian Michael Blackson is one example. He's a person who has created an entire career from this Western humor. And I just know he tickles the tummies of a lot of whites and blacks by exaggerating himself as being so black, right? They all get this stuff from the Europeans and the whites. And there's really no need to elaborate on the soldier's remarks about the heels sticking out a feet behind, right? That's even more foolish. But let's keep going. A New England soldier in Louisiana wrote his brother with a mixture of revulsion and attraction.
If I marry anyone at all, I believe I'll marry one of these wenches down here. One that grease runs right off of, one that shines, and one that stinks. So you can smell her a mile. and then you can have time to get out of the way.
More foolishness. But it's important to see because these ideas are attached to blackness, and they contribute to the curse of self-hate for those who identify as that, right? That's why the black thing has to be done away for some people in the final phase of freedom. Such disparagements were neither uncommon nor limited to Negrophobes. Even those Yankee soldiers who claimed to be anti-slavery expressed their amusement at the physical appearance and demeanor of the enslaved blacks, revealing more about their own backgrounds and biases than about the objects of their sympathy.
There is something irresistibly comical in their appearance,
wrote one such soldier.
They are so black.
You see what I mean? There is something irresistibly comical to the whites about this. And they transferred all of those feelings and prejudices into the minds of the enslaved people with the rich brown skin. And once they internalized it, they began to look at each other and at themselves in the same light, right? They started to think that it was something irresistibly comical about themselves as well, right? They began asking other questions. Why are you so black? And teasing people by calling them blackie and the likes, right? Their minds have been hijacked with centuries of self-destructive ideas.
And their teeth are of such dazzling whiteness, their eyes so laughing and rolling, their clothes so fantastic, and their whole appearance so peculiar.
Everything about them was strange to him. The Yankees expected to find a degraded, inferior, primitive people who were at the same time picturesque, comical, indolent, and carefree, always wearing a happy and contented expression, displaying their broad grins, touching their hats to the white folks, answering questions politely and humbly. That was the kind of Negro they had seen cavorting across the minstrel stages of the North and pictured in the popular literature, and now they were simply viewing Sambo and Dinah in their natural habitat.
Until I saw and conversed with the greater number of these persons,
a Northern reporter wrote from South Carolina,
I believed that the appearance and intelligence of Southern field hands were greatly libeled by the delineators of Negro character at the concert saloons.
This reporter thought the shows in the North were great exaggerations of the Negro's character. In those shows, they would depict Negroes as submissive, obedient, ignorant, dirty, and so forth.
Now I cannot but acknowledge that instead of gross exaggerations, the minstrels give representations which are faithful to nature. There were the same grotesque dresses, awkward figures, and immense brogans which are to be seen every night at Bryant's or Christie's.
He says that when he saw it in person, he had to admit that those shows were not exaggerating, but they were rather telling an accurate depiction of these people. Now, surely there would be some truth in what he's saying, because slavery made manifest that type of character in the Negro. But certainly there were still many elements of exaggeration, right? That's without a doubt. They would just take what they saw and they would take it to the 10th power. Nor did the Yankees obviously expect to find any particular intelligence exhibited by these minstrel-like characters, quite apart from the laws that barred them from learning to read or write. Thus did a Union soldier, who was himself barely literate, inform his parents that the he had encountered
don't know as much as a dumb brute.
Although the prevailing image pictured blacks as a happy-go-lucky and carefree race, at best a source of amusement, some Yankee soldiers came away with altogether different impressions. The slaves they saw did not resemble the rollicking, joyous, devil-may-care African they had anticipated, nor did they hear any of the laughter and jubilant songs that were said to radiate from the slave cabins. When he had come to the South, Private Henry T. Johns of Massachusetts, like most of his comrades, had believed that the blacks,
if not a happy race, were at least careless and light-hearted.
But the longer he remained in the South, the more skeptical he became of that stereotype.
I have been with them a great deal,
he wrote from Louisiana,
and never before saw so much of gloom, despondency, and listlessness. I saw no banjo, heard none but solemn songs. In church or on the street, they impressed me with a great sadness. They are a somber, not a happy race.
That's part of the pain that speaks out through blackness. That's what he experienced. Several weeks later, when his regiment was encamped near Baton Rouge, he attended a black religious service and described the
mingled excitement and devotion,
the shouting, the clapping of hands, the jumping, the often wild and excited singing. It all impressed him, however, as
a mournful joy,
and the hymn seemed
more a loud wail than a burst of joyous melody. When praying about their enslaved condition, or for the dying, or for the salvation of poor sinners, they unitedly break out into the most plaintive chorus imaginable. I can't describe it, but to my dying hour I shall remember it. It seemed like the incarnation of sadness. I could think of nothing but a mother in heaven wailing for her lost son. Almost like a nightmare, it clings to me, ever presenting depths of sadness and resignation beyond my conception.
That's part of being in the pit of darkness, surrounded without hope and with no vision, right? Those were the sounds which he described as an incarnation of sadness. The thousands of slaves who flocked to the Union lines were apt to encounter the same prejudices, the same exploitation, the same disparagement, the same capacity for sadistic cruelty which they thought they had left behind them on the plantations and farms. To belittle the slave's character, dress, language, name, and demeanor, to make him the butt of their humor, to ridicule his aspirations, to mock his religious worship, to exploit his illiteracy, were ways of passing the duller moments of camp life and military occupation. Enlisted troops come up with some of the dumbest things to do when they're bored and they need to pass time. That's just part of the military culture. So I know back then that they certainly took advantage of the blacks. Besides, the manipulation of blacks for the amusement of white audiences had a long and accepted tradition behind it.
There were 5 Negroes in our mess room last night.
A New England soldier wrote from Virginia.
We got them to sing and dance. Great times. Negro concerts free of expense here.
You see that? Sarah Dubrow, who had been a slave in North Carolina, recalled the Yankee soldiers who threatened to shoot her toes off unless she danced for them. And other former slaves remembered, too, how the Yankees forced them to sing and dance and called them funny names. The soldiers who shared in these diversions did so regardless of their feelings about slavery and emancipation. Henry M. Cross constantly deplored racist sentiment in his regiment. What he had seen of the slaves, he wrote, made him despise even more intensely the bondage,
which has brought them to their miserable condition.
But even as he made that comment, Private Cross wrote of a 16-year-old black youth attached to the adjutant in his camp.
He is filthy and lazy, and seems to know as much as a child of 4 years, and yet, once in a while shows gleams of intelligence beyond his years and condition. He never looks at you when talking, but shifts uneasily from one leg to the other, and turns his head from side to side, rolling his eyes and grunting queer laughs. We make all kinds of sport of him.
He still couldn't help but to join in, right? These were the ways of the white consciousness, and especially so during its peak period. So hopefully you have gleaned the finer message from this commentary, and it has given you something to contemplate and something to think about as we continue to decolonize the mind. And so with that, we continue it to the next. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.